David, an ICU nurse, never expected his coma patient to leave him a secret message. But when Malcolm, unconscious for months, suddenly moves and writes something chilling, David realizes this is just the beginning of a terrifying truth. Watch till the end to uncover the mystery. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. David Miller walked through the dimly lit hallways of St. Francis Medical Center, adjusting his scrubs as he prepared for another long night shift in the ICU. He had worked here for years, tending to critical patients, witnessing miraculous recoveries, and grieving for those who never woke up. But tonight, something felt different. His instincts told him to pay extra attention to room 214, the room where Malcolm Gray had lain unconscious for 3 months. Malcolm had been admitted after a brutal accident, found unconscious in an alleyway with severe head trauma. No identification, no witnesses. His medical records showed no sign of prior conditions, and yet he had not regained consciousness since the night he arrived. Doctors had written him off as another coma case with slim chances of recovery. But David had always felt there was something different about him. As he checked Malcolm's vitals, everything appeared stable. The machines beeped in their usual rhythm, his heartbeat steady. David adjusted the IV, then turned to leave, but something made him stop. His eyes flickered to the brain activity monitor. His breath caught. The numbers were rising rapidly. That shouldn't be happening. Coma patients had relatively stable activity patterns, barely fluctuating, but Malcolm's readings were erratic, spiking higher than they had ever been before. David leaned in, looking for any sign of movement. His pulse quickened when he saw it. A single tear rolling down Malcolm's cheek. His first instinct was to call for a doctor, but he hesitated. Reflexes, that's what they would say. Just involuntary muscle reactions, but something about it felt deliberate. He reached for a tissue and gently wiped the tear away. "Malcolm?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. David took a deep breath, stepping back. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe sleep deprivation was messing with his head. He had seen too many false hopes in this place. But then, just as he turned to leave, Malcolm's fingers twitched. David froze, his mind racing. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But it was real. Swallowing hard, he stepped closer. "Malcolm, if you can hear me, move your hand again." For a moment, silence. The machines continued their steady beeping. Then a second twitch. David's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and pressing record. "Malcolm, can you do that again?" Seconds passed. Then, slowly, Malcolm's index finger twitched. David exhaled sharply. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't a reflex. Malcolm was responding. He rushed out of the room, heading straight for Dr. Richard Hughes, the senior physician overseeing the ICU. He burst into Hughes's office, out of breath. "Doctor, you need to come with me," he said urgently. Hughes looked up from his files, frowning. "David, what is it?" "It's Malcolm Gray. He's responding." Hughes sighed, rubbing his temples. "David, you've been on shift too long. Coma patients have involuntary—" "This is not involuntary," David interrupted. "I saw a tear roll down his face. I saw his fingers move, and I recorded it." Hughes studied him for a moment, then let out a sigh. "Fine. Let's see." They walked briskly back to room 214. David's heart pounded as he stepped inside, silently praying that Malcolm would move again. Hughes checked the monitors. His eyes narrowed at the abnormal brain activity. "That's unusual," he admitted. Then he leaned closer. "Malcolm, if you can hear me, move your fingers." Silence. David held his breath. Nothing. Hughes turned to him, exasperated. "David, I respect your instincts, but this—" Then Malcolm's fingers moved. Hughes stopped mid-sentence. His eyes flickered with surprise. David knew that look, the look of doubt cracking. "He's trying to communicate," David said, his voice steadier now. Hughes ran a hand through his hair. This isn't normal, but we can't jump to conclusions yet." He turned to David. "Keep monitoring him, but don't get your hopes up too soon." David clenched his jaw. He knew what he had seen. He wasn't about to let this go. That night, he stayed beside Malcolm's bed, watching. He felt it again, just barely. The weakest squeeze against his fingers. It wasn't just a fluke. Determined to prove that Malcolm's movements weren't just involuntary reflexes, he reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out a pen and paper. Gently, he positioned Malcolm's fingers around the pen. "If you can hear me," he whispered, "try to write something." Silence stretched between them. David held his breath, staring at Malcolm's unmoving hand. Doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if he was just seeing what he wanted to see? Then the pen wobbled slightly. David's pulse quickened. The movements were slow, shaky, almost unreadable, but they were there. Lines formed, jagged and weak but deliberate. Letters, numbers. David's hands trembled as he lifted the paper, squinting at the scribbled writing. It didn't make sense at first. Then, realization hit him like a brick. These were coordinates. David grabbed his phone and quickly typed the numbers into a search engine. A map appeared. His stomach twisted. The coordinates led to an abandoned industrial complex just outside the city. David's breath caught. How the hell did Malcolm, a man in a coma, know about this place? David sat frozen, staring at the coordinates on his phone screen. His heart pounded as his mind raced through every possible explanation. There was no way Malcolm, who had been in a coma for 3 months, could have known about this location. Unless this place was connected to whatever had happened to him. He needed answers. He needed help. Without wasting another second, David grabbed his phone and called Nate Carter, his closest friend and a former cybersecurity expert who now worked in medical IT. If anyone could dig up information on this place, it was him. Nate answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "David? It's almost midnight, man. What's going on?" David took a deep breath. "I need you to check something for me. Right now." There was a pause, then the sound of rustling. "All right. What is it?" David rattled off the coordinates. "I think it's an abandoned industrial site outside the city, but I need to know everything you can find on it." "Industrial site?" Nate muttered. "Hold on." David listened to the rapid clicking of a keyboard as Nate worked. He paced the empty hallway outside Malcolm's room, his nerves on edge. "Okay," Nate said after a few minutes. "This place is weird. Officially, it was decommissioned about 10 years ago. Used to be a research facility, but the records are incomplete. Some files are missing, and I don't mean just regular missing, I mean erased. Like someone went out of their way to delete any trace of what happened there." David's grip on his phone tightened. "You're telling me someone covered it up?" "Looks like it. But here's the thing. The site isn't completely abandoned. Satellite images show activity." David stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "There are signs of movement, vehicle tracks in and out of the area, recent disturbances in the terrain. Whatever this place was, it's still in use. And someone doesn't want people knowing about it." A cold chill ran down David's spine. "What the hell is going on?" Nate asked. David hesitated. "I think Malcolm was trying to tell me something." "Malcolm?" Nate repeated. You mean the coma patient? David explained everything. How Malcolm had moved, how he had written down the coordinates, and how his brain activity had spiked out of nowhere. There was silence on the other end of the line. David, Nate finally said, his voice serious, this is insane. I know, David admitted, but it's real. And if Malcolm knows about this place, then maybe it's connected to why he's here in the first place. Nate exhaled sharply. This is out of our league, man. You need to tell someone. I will, David said. I just need to be sure first. Hanging up, he made his way back to Dr. Hughes's office. He had already pushed the senior physician once tonight, but this was too big to ignore. Hughes looked up from his paperwork, already sighing before David even spoke. David, if this is about the patient again. It's about what he wrote, David interrupted, placing the paper on Hughes's desk. These are coordinates. Hughes frowned. Coordinates? David nodded. I checked. They lead to an abandoned research facility, but it's not really abandoned. Someone's still using it. Hughes rubbed his temple. David, do you realize how insane this sounds? A man in a coma writing down secret coordinates? Yes, I do, David snapped. But I also know what I saw. And I know that place is real. If Malcolm is connected to it, don't you think we need to find out why? Hughes exhaled. He stared at the paper for a long moment, then finally picked up the phone. I'll call the police. David let out a breath of relief, but his stomach remained tight. Something told him that whatever they found at that facility wouldn't be good. The next morning, Detective Marcus Blake and his team arrived at the hospital. Blake was a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being relentless. He listened as David and Hughes explained the situation, his expression unreadable. Coordinates from a coma patient, Blake finally said. That's a first. I know how it sounds, David admitted. But if there's even a chance that something is going on at that facility, don't you think it's worth checking out? Blake studied him for a moment, then nodded. We'll take a look. David expected to feel relieved, but instead an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. That night, as he sat by Malcolm's bedside, he whispered, We're going to find out what happened to you. Malcolm's fingers twitched, David's breath hitched. It was the strongest movement yet, and in that moment, he knew. Malcolm was fighting his way back. The police arrived at the coordinates just before dawn. Detective Marcus Blake led the team, his gut already telling him this wasn't going to be a routine investigation. The location matched what David had described, an old industrial complex, its outer walls covered in ivy and decay. Official records claim the facility had been shut down years ago, but something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too complete, as if the place itself was holding its breath. The entrance was secured with heavy metal doors, rusted but not untouched. Closer inspection revealed fresh scratches around the locks, recent activity. Blake gestured for his team to move in. The first officer stepped forward, crowbar in hand, working at the locks. It took several minutes of force before the last latch snapped open with a loud crack. The doors groaned as they swung inward, revealing a long corridor leading underground. The air inside was thick with dust, mildew, and something else, something metallic, like dried blood. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead, casting eerie shadows along the walls. David stood just behind Blake, heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. Hughes had insisted he stay at the hospital, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see this for himself. Blake's team moved cautiously through the hallway, sweeping their flashlights along the walls. Rusted medical equipment was strewn about, examination tables covered in dust, overturned chairs left as if someone had fled in a hurry. Some cabinets still held supplies, IV bags, syringes, even old patient files, all untouched for years. And then, as they moved deeper into the facility, things changed. The dust wasn't as thick. Some of the equipment looked used. Recently. Blake's voice was low. "This place isn't abandoned." A noise echoed from somewhere in the back. Everyone froze. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A rustling. A breath. Blake signaled his team to move forward. The sound led them to a heavy steel door, different from the others. It was reinforced, secured with multiple locks. Someone, or something, was inside. "Breach it," Blake ordered. One of the officers stepped up, bolt cutter in hand. One by one, the locks snapped open. The final latch hit the ground with a metallic clang. Blake raised his weapon. Then, with one swift kick, he forced the door open. Inside, huddled in the corner, was a young man. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, his body trembling. His wrists bore raw, red marks, signs of prolonged restraint. His eyes were wide with terror, darting between the officers. David inhaled sharply. Darius Gray. Malcolm's son. One of the officers lowered his weapon, stepping forward cautiously. "It's okay," he said in a calm voice. "You're safe now." Darius flinched, pressing himself against the wall. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was terrified. David couldn't hold back anymore. He stepped past the officers kneeling beside Darius. "Hey," he whispered, "my name is David. You're safe. We're here to help you." Darius's lips trembled. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "My dad." David's chest tightened. "He's alive. He's in the hospital, and he led us to you." Tears welled in Darius's eyes. He sagged forward, exhaustion overtaking him. The officers moved quickly, wrapping him in a blanket, guiding him to his feet. But just as David thought they were safe, a gunshot rang through the air. Everyone ducked, weapons raised, as a figure stepped into the dim light from the far end of the corridor. A man in a medical coat, holding a pistol in a shaking grip. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with rage. "You don't understand," he rasped, his voice cracked, his breath erratic. "He was supposed to stay here." Blake's voice was sharp. "Drop your weapon." The man didn't move. His fingers twitched around the trigger. His eyes darted between them, desperate, unhinged. "You ruined everything," he whispered. David's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an abandoned facility. This was a prison. The man raised his gun, but before he could fire, one of the officers tackled him to the ground. The struggle lasted only seconds before he was restrained, his wrists locked in handcuffs. Darius let out a sob, burying his face in his hands. David placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he murmured. "You're safe now." But as the officers secured the area, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Who else had been here? How many others had suffered before Darius? And how deep did this nightmare go? The ambulance ride back to the hospital was silent, except for Darius's quiet, uneven breathing. He sat wrapped in a blanket, his hands trembling, his face pale and gaunt. David stayed by his side, holding onto his arm whenever the boy tensed or flinched at sudden sounds. The trauma was still fresh, the weight of what he had endured pressing down on him. Every few moments, he would look at David as if to reassure himself that this was real, that he was no longer trapped in that underground prison. When they arrived at St. Francis Medical Center, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting. Darius stiffened at the sight of them, his body instinctively recoiling, but David gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe here." Darius hesitated before nodding weakly. The medical staff led him to a private room where they began their assessments. David stayed close, refusing to leave him alone. He knew Darius was still too afraid to be left in the care of strangers, even those who meant well. Meanwhile, Detective Blake was speaking with Dr. Hughes in a nearby corridor. His expression was grim as he recounted what they had found at the facility. "That place wasn't just abandoned," he said. "It was operational, and whatever they were doing down there, it wasn't legal." Hughes exhaled, running a hand down his face. "What about the man you arrested?" Blake shook his head. "He refuses to talk, but we ran his prints. His name is Dr. Philip Cross. He was a licensed physician until his medical license was revoked 5 years ago for conducting unethical experiments. He disappeared after that." Hughes' brows furrowed. "And now we know where he went." Blake nodded. "We also found medical records in that facility, old and new, hidden files, signs that people had been taken there for testing. Some didn't make it." His voice was tight with anger. David, who had been listening nearby, clenched his fists. "And Darius? Do we know what they did to him?" Blake's expression darkened. "He's too shaken to give details right now, but the files we found suggest they were running long-term experiments. We don't know how many others were involved, or how many victims there were." David's stomach churned. "Jesus." Blake nodded. "This isn't over." David felt a sudden urgency. He turned back toward Malcolm's room, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He needed to check on him. He needed to tell him that his son was safe. When he reached room 214, he hesitated for a brief moment before stepping inside. The machines hummed softly, their beeping steady and unchanged. Malcolm looked just as he had before, still and silent. David approached the bed and took Malcolm's hand in his. He leaned in close and whispered, "We found him. Darius is safe." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Malcolm's fingers twitched. David's breath caught. It was the strongest response yet. He squeezed Malcolm's hand gently. "Can you hear me? Move your hand again if you can." Another weak twitch. David's pulse quickened. "Malcolm, your son is okay. You saved him." The hand in his grasp trembled, and then, barely above a whisper, Malcolm's lips parted. One word escaped. "Darius." David gasped. His heart pounded. Malcolm was waking up. He turned toward the door, ready to call for Dr. Hughes, for anyone who could confirm what he had just felt. Then, slowly, weakly, Malcolm's eyes fluttered open. David sucked in a shaky breath. "Malcolm?" The man's gaze was unfocused, distant, as if caught between the past and present. His lips barely moved, but David saw it, the sheer force of will pushing against exhaustion. The door burst open as Dr. Hughes and 2 nurses rushed in. "What happened?" Hughes demanded, moving quickly to the bedside. David's voice was unsteady. "He's responding." He said Darius' name. Hughes leaned in, studying Malcolm closely. "Malcolm, can you hear me?" Malcolm's throat worked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Darius!" David turned, sprinting out of the room. He didn't care how tired he was. He needed to bring Darius here. He rushed back to the private room where Darius was resting. The young man looked up, startled by David's sudden arrival. David caught his breath. "Your dad is waking up." Darius's eyes widened, his lips parted in disbelief. "What?" David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Come on, he's asking for you." Darius hesitated only for a second before swinging his legs over the bed. He was weak, but David helped him stand, guiding him through the hallway. When they reached Malcolm's room, Darius stopped just outside the door, fear flickering in his eyes. "What if he doesn't remember me?" he whispered. David gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "You were the first thing he said." Darius swallowed hard, then stepped inside. Malcolm's eyes landed on him immediately, and something inside him seemed to break. A choked sob escaped his lips as he weakly reached out his trembling fingers. Darius hesitated for only a second before crossing the room in 2 steps, collapsing against his father's frail form. Malcolm held on to him as tightly as his weak arms would allow. Tears slipped down his face. "My boy," Malcolm whispered. "My beautiful boy." Darius clung to him, his body shaking. "I thought I lost you." "I never left you," Malcolm rasped, voice hoarse but filled with emotion. David stood back, watching the reunion with a lump in his throat. He had fought so hard to bring them back together, and now, seeing them hold each other, he knew it had all been worth it. Hours later, after the initial rush of emotions had settled, David sat outside Malcolm's room, exhaustion finally creeping in. Detective Blake approached, hands in his pockets. "He's stable?" David nodded. "He's awake, talking. It'll take time, but he's here." Blake exhaled. "You saved them." David shook his head. "Malcolm saved his son. I just listened." Blake gave him a small nod of respect. "Cross is in custody. He hasn't said much, but with the evidence we found at that facility, he won't be walking free anytime soon." David let out a slow breath. "Good." Blake glanced toward Malcolm's room. "They're going to need protection. If there were more people involved in that place, we don't know if they'll come looking." David's stomach twisted. He had been so focused on saving Malcolm and Darius that he hadn't thought about what came next. Blake placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep them safe. You did your part." David nodded, exhaustion finally settling into his bones as Blake walked away. Inside the room, Malcolm and Darius remained together, father and son reunited after months of horror. And yet, deep in his gut, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. This story proves that even in the darkest moments, determination and courage can uncover the truth. But is this really the end, or just the beginning of something bigger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.